Hey, how's it going, everyone? Another project video for you here. This one's pretty simple. I suppose you could call it a woodworking project, but it barely involves any woodworking, and there's really only two major operations. And that's cutting down this 1x6 to the length and the width that I need, and then routering out a channel for this T-track to sit in, which is the most complicated thing about this, really. And this idea was born from a comment my wife, Sandy, made about wanting to hang some plants up in front of the window that's in our front room. And the way she described it was that she wanted to make a sort of plant curtain. And that stuck with me for two reasons. One is the curtain thing. I wanted to make something that you could hang the plants from in such a way that they sort of acted like a curtain, or could be configured, I guess, like a curtain, like sliding to the left and right or side to side or what have you. But then also I wanted to avoid putting a bunch of large holes in the ceiling because it's a fairly wide window. So you're talking like 5 or more plants hanging from the ceiling, and the anchors for the hooks that you would have to use. You know, that's like a 3/8 inch hole at least, or so, 5 or 6 of those in the ceiling. If you want to take the hooks out, maybe you don't want the plants there anymore. That's a lot of fairly large holes that you'd have to fill in if you took the hooks out. Now, this doesn't avoid the quantity of the holes problem, because it does take quite a few holes to actually mount this up, but it does avoid the size of the holes problem, at least mostly. So the channel I'm routering out here, where the T-track will go, the board length is basically the width of the window plus a little, so that I could center it and get in contact with as many joists as possible to give the whole thing a solid, anchor. So wherever there's a joist that lands on the length of this board, a screw goes in on either side of the channel. So basically 2 screws per joist, which ends up being 10 screws in total. Actually 11, but I'll talk about that 11th one later. But the important thing is they're smaller holes, significantly smaller. I think I used like number 9 screws. So if I ended up taking this down, they're small and easy to patch holes. So the reason I'm trimming this little piece off here is just because either my fence was off or my measuring was off, but the channel was not quite in the center of the board, and it doesn't matter at all. The dimensions really aren't super important in this case, but I was just being pedantic and trimmed it so that the channel was centered. So on the track, first off, this is not a prescribed use for T-track, and typically this track is used in like a shop environment, in a workbench to clamp things, or like I use it on my miter station for a stop block. It does have a variety of uses, but I don't think the manufacturer would condone its use for hanging things from overhead. So this is not a prescribed use. But the stuff I have is 48 inches long, and I'm using a full section on the left and on the right hand side of the board. And then I'll cut down a piece to fit the center. And the reason for that is one, not that it matters, but this is just the layout that made sense to me visually. And then also, I tried to maximize the number of holes that I had available to mount the T-track to the board without having to drill any additional holes because I was being lazy. So I used 2 full-length pieces on either end, and then I cut a piece to fit in the center. Now on the screws, so the way I mounted the T-track to my miter station was just to use some small, I think number 6 wood screws, and that works just fine for that application. But because this is hanging something from overhead, not that anyone is standing under it or anything, but I generally want to avoid things falling from the ceiling. So I wanted to use machine screws that go all the way through the track and all the way through the board. And I was originally going to use just a nut and a washer here on the back. But then I remembered that T-nuts are a thing, and they are neat because as you tighten the screw and they get pulled into the wood, they have teeth on them that grab into the wood, into the board, so that they stay in place. And what's nice about that, which really isn't super important in this project, although I did use it later on, is that you can actually take the screw out and the T-nut stays in place. So if I needed to, this could be mounted on the ceiling, and I could unscrew all the screws and take the track off, and the nuts would stay in place. So at this point, the whole assembly is basically put together with the exception of trimming off the excess track on either end. And I've got the blue tape on the ceiling here that's marking where the studs are. I use that to figure out how long I needed to make the board. And right now I'm positioning it where I want it to actually be mounted, and then using my stud finder and a neodymium magnet to make triple sure that I know where the studs are. because once I have the position set, I'm going to take a small drill bit and drill through the board and then into the ceiling to mark the location of the holes. Here I'm counterboring the screw holes, and I couldn't find my 3/8 inch Forstner bit for some reason, so I'm just using a regular drill bit, which is a little bit ill-advised just because, I mean, this is soft pine, so it's a losing battle anyway, but it sort of tears up the wood. And this is a brand new drill bit, so it's not that it's not sharp, but just tends to tear a little bit. So the holes are not as clean as they would have been if I'd used a Forstner bit. And I cut some plugs to cover where the screws are going to go, and they'll be painted the same as the board, which is going to be painted white to match the ceiling. I was going to just use those button head style screw covers, but because the spacing of the joists isn't even, I thought that it would look weird to have unevenly spaced little button heads sticking out of the board. I'm not really interested in necessarily trying to hide where the screws are, but I just thought it would look weird because of the uneven spacing of the joists, and hence the uneven spacing of the screws. So the T-Track colors I could find were only plain aluminum, red, and blue. And I didn't think painting it would work in this case. I'm not really trying to hide it, but it did look a little grungy. You know, it's typically something that's put in the shop, so I'm basically just sanding it to give it a brushed aluminum look. And the secret for this, I've done this a few times for different projects, and the secret is basically staying in one direction. Now, I initially do sand back and forth, which is fine when you're just trying to get the bigger blemishes and gouges out. But for the final sanding, I put the sandpaper on a block, and I go in one direction. I lift up, come back, and go in the same direction. And then I finish up with some superfine Scotch-Brite. I mean, you could take this as far as, you know, polishing it with polishing compound and whatever if you really wanted to, but the important thing is to only go in one direction. You don't want to use an orbital sander or a vibrating sander or anything like that. You just end up with a bunch of random scratches in the aluminum that are really hard to get out. Trust me, I've done that before, and it does not work out well. So this is the way to do it. And I don't know if it comes across on camera that well, but there's a fairly significant difference between what it looked like before sanding and what it looks like after sanding. And so here's the final mounting after I trimmed the T-Track to its final length on both ends there. And there's one issue that I'll address here in a minute that I had to fix after this. But yeah, this is the final mounting. So these are the plugs that I used to cover up the screws. Because I wasn't super precise when counterboring the holes for them, each one is a little bit different in length. So I cut out the plugs the full length that I could, and then once the board was mounted, I put them in the hole where they're going to go, and I wrapped some blue tape around them to mark the length so I knew where to trim them. And I'm just gluing some tape down here on this board so I can paint them. I'm actually doing this backwards because what you'd really want to do is actually put a piece of blue tape down. Normally just tape the tape to the board, put some CA glue or super glue on that piece of tape, and then put a piece of tape upside down, stick side up, on that, because then it would preserve your board. But this is just a scrap piece of MDF, so it's not a big deal. And I'm just using this so I can hold these little plugs down now that they're trimmed. And they are labeled on the back side, the part that's going down on the tape, so I know which hole they go on or go in, so they sit flush now that they're trimmed. So some footage of the hooks being made is coming up here. It bears a little bit of an explanation, only because it seemed like it would be intuitive at first, but actually I ended up waiting until everything was mounted and done to figure out the hooks, because it wasn't as intuitive as I thought it would be. The T-Track will take either a 5/16 T-bolt or a 1/4-20 bolt head. It won't fit a 1/4-20 nut because they're too thick. So I was trying to come up with, you know, I mean, there's several ways you could do this, but I was trying to come up with something that didn't look obnoxious and look nice and everything. So I ended up finding these 1/4-20 jam nuts on McMaster-Carr, which are thin enough to fit inside of the T-Track. Fortunately, these are the shortest hooks that I could find, so I ended up having to cut these down because I want them to be as short as possible, to sit as close to the whole assembly as possible. I don't want them hanging down any more than they really need to be. And again, I'm being pedantic about attaching these with the thread lock, and then I'll pin them over here, as you'll see in a little bit. Now, an important thing that I'm showing here is that the flats of the nut need to be positioned so that the hook is positioned where you want. So in this case, I wanted the hooks to be perpendicular to the track. And I learned this the hard way because I did the first couple and then realized, wait, the direction of the flats on the nut matters. They dictate the direction the hook is facing when it's in the T-track. And so here I'm pinning over the bolt. Like I said, this is probably not necessary, but like the Loctite, it's just to help avoid the nut from coming loose. And so here is that thing that I've been alluding to this whole time. This is the one place in the whole thing where I did use a regular drywall anchor to help attach the board to the ceiling. And the reason for this is because on the left-hand side of the board, the distance between the last joist that was available to screw into and the end of the board was enough that the board was kind of left flapping in the breeze a little bit, and it wasn't being pushed up against the ceiling as much as I would have liked it to have been. And it was enough that I was just a little bit concerned that if a plant was hung that far down, that at the very least over time it may cause issues with the board sagging or possibly even breaking. So I went ahead and basically took the whole thing down and put a drywall anchor and screwed it into the board from underneath the T-track to hide it. And here it is hung up, and with the first plant that I hung from it to test it out. Now, admittedly, it doesn't curtain as well as I imagined it would, in that the plants don't slide as easily as I was imagining they would. And it really comes down to the fact that I'm just misusing the T-track here. It's not meant to have things hanging from it and slide easily. So if you don't do it quite correctly enough, the hook binds in the T-track. The technique that I've found is that you just want to hold the plant from the base to take a little bit of the weight off, and then use your other hand to slide the plant along the track where you want it. And I'm sure that there are other ways that you can come up with to make it so that they'd be super easy to slide along the track. But in this case, I think it serves the purpose of being able to to hang the plants in the first place and then position them anywhere along basically the width of the window where you'd want them to be without being some big obnoxious contraption. And I'm also glad that we decided to paint the board white to match the ceiling. Originally, when I thought of this, I thought about using walnut as the wood and making the mount itself sort of a feature. But I'm glad that Sandy suggested painting it white because it sort of blends in better, obviously. And she actually made the comment when I had it up while I was still making the hooks and there wasn't anything hanging from it, that it just sort of blends in. I mean, of course, you still see it, but it's not obnoxious or intentionally standing out. So if you just wanted to take the plants down, it's not a super obtrusive thing. It's not going to be like, why do you have this piece of walnut mounted on your ceiling type of thing. So we're happy with the way it came out. I hope you found this useful, maybe inspires you, and thanks for watching.